Mansfield!
I think it's probably been a long enough wait since I did the first part of the Impossible Ports series. I've left it a few months since putting together that original list, and wait, no, it's been 4 years. But hey, I did say I'd come back to this topic, so here we are. And all I said before still rings true. Sometimes it does just feel like a game shouldn't be possible on the thing you're playing it on. We're in a less fragmented era these days where scalability and cross-platform porting is a much more straightforward process, something baked in from day one, pretty much. But back in the ancient past, there were many times when games that shouldn't have worked on a thing, worked on a thing. No, they're not literally impossible, that's hyperbole for the sake of a video title, but here's 9 ports that really shouldn't have worked as well as they did. And this time around, there's nothing on the Switch. Go. Released only in Europe towards the tail end of the NES's relevancy, it's understandable that Elite flew under the radar for quite a time. But over the years it popped up more and more on folks' radars, gathering a fair bit of a following and the right amount of kudos to celebrate what a ridiculous achievement this port was for Nintendo's 8-bit wonder. From a power and grunt perspective, there was little question the NES would be capable of handling something like Elite, a game launched almost a decade prior to its eventual Ninty release, originally on the BBC Micro. But there was another major element at play, holding developers David Braben and Ian Bell back from getting their classic spacefaring trader shooter Pirater onto the NES. The damnable game used wireframe 3D visuals. The NES didn't do 3D. And yet, as you can see from the footage here, for a console that didn't do 3D, it certainly looked like the NES had managed to do some pretty good 3D. It wasn't really 3D in a true sense, of course. The NES was only capable of handling sprites, not wireframe graphics moving at a decent pace. But what the devs did for the Nintendo machine was, well, it was just being really very clever with the tools available to them. The NES essentially drew from a set of tiles to produce the graphics you saw on screen for any given game. Elite used this tile sprite system, as it had to, but smartly messed about with things like perspective, refreshing animations, hiding lines that were being drawn, and plenty of other factors that basically amounted to smoke and mirrors. The NES didn't do 3D, but Elite on NES wasn't 3D, so it worked on the console. But it was such a convincing fakery of 3D that it didn't matter, it wasn't really being done. This was effectively the NES running a fully 3D game containing a whole galaxy to explore, trade, fight and die in. Unless you were playing with cheats enabled, in which case you'd get stranded after being intercepted by a bunch of Thargoids. Ahem. I can't go very deep into the technical aspects of how this port came to be or how it worked, but there's a great video by Chiropolis that ticks all that off, so I've put the link for it in the description. But please come back here after you've watched that, okay? Cool? And it wasn't just smart jiggery-pokery getting the game's visuals up and running on a console that shouldn't have been able to display them. Elite on NES added a bunch of other nips, tweaks and tucks that actually made it one of the best versions of the game to play. It wasn't the definitive version, I think that's roundly accepted to be the Acorn Archimedes port. But NES Elite's icon-based control scheme, navigation computer as standard, images and portraits, and other little quality-of-life additions here and there made it one of the preferred ways to experience the space sim. Not bad for a console that didn't do 3D. An arcade sequel to Hard Drivin', Race Drivin' was precisely the kind of game I couldn't be bothered with in 1990. The bloody arcade machine had a clutch pedal, who has time for that? But yeah, it was a racing game of a more simulation-y ilk than most other coin-up drive-em-ups, and it stood out as a result of both this and the fact it was riding the wave of then cutting-edge polygonal 3D video games making the rounds. I didn't care for it, and I still don't care for it, and I'm not just saying that because I drive an automatic and playing it on MAME for this video was a chore. Regardless, Race Drivin' was not the sort of thing you'd expect to get any sort of proper decent home ports. You get passable but forgettable console versions, which is what happened. And it certainly wasn't the sort of thing you'd think would get a really bloody impressive version made for one of the weakest devices doing the rounds in the early 90s, the Game Boy. Argonaut Software said, "Hold my beer," or whatever that thing is, and crafted a port that was arguably more impressive than those that made their way to other significantly more capable platforms like the SNES and Mega Drive. Race driving on Nintendo's Cuboid of Joy still wasn't a patch on the arcade original. Obviously, only a fool, a buffoon, would expect anything else. But equally, only a buffoon, a fool, would have expected a Game Boy port to be this accomplished. Trickery abound, frame rates on the lower end of the tolerable scale, a limited experience, sure, but this was recognisably a version of the original game. If you'd played race driving in the arcade, you would know what this Game Boy game was after not too long. And yeah, maybe you'd have to squint a bit, but it was there. It's of little surprise this was made by the same Argonaut that went on to create the SNES's Super FX chip, Star Fox and its sequel, and had already made the just as technically impressive X for Game Boy. Yes, race driving wasn't much fun to actually play, and it didn't exactly go down in history as one of the handheld's greats. It was no world bowling after all. But there can be little argument against Argonaut's accomplishments in making this one of the most surprising, impressive ports of what was at the time a pretty cutting-edge title in arcades. It hinted at a future of 3D gaming joy on the handheld that, well, wasn't realised. But race driving showed it could have been. It's fair if you don't think it looks it now, but MDK was a very technically tricksy and ambitious PC game from Shiny Entertainment back in the late 90s. To describe it in an eminently reductive fashion, the game was a third-person shooter. The run-and-gun action obscured all of the massive efforts that had gone into making the game run as well as it did and feature, features such as a sniper scope with 100 times zoom functionality and no pop-up or fogging. And all of this running in software, no GPU required, on a modest Pentium CPU and asking a mere 16 megabytes of RAM. MDK was a triumph of smart development decisions on its PC home, where all of the ideas, well, most of the ideas dreamed up by the coders, designers, artists, and whoever else wanted to stick their oar in could be realised. If the game's engine had to be rewritten to slot something in, so be it. Aside from making sure the whole thing ran at least 30 frames per second at all times, MDK was a project pretty much without compromise. Which is what made the port to the original PlayStation all the more surprising. Here was a machine with just a couple of megabytes of RAM, a CPU that had no chance of emerging victorious against the Pentiums of the day, and zero hard drive functionality. Additionally, the porting team at Neversoft, pre-Tony Hawk, was given 6 months to get the game onto Sony's console. And Shiny was still developing the game for PC, so Neversoft had to deal with regular changes they had to factor into the port. MDK on PS1 didn't look as good as the PC game, and sometimes the frame rate did drop a bit below that fabled 30 FPS that held so steady on the original version. Other than that, it was superb. It ran as quickly as the PC game. You could argue there was a more comfortable control method with the PS1's joypad. All the levels and some bonus ones were intact, and even the sniper helmet was able to zoom into its 100 times magnification without any popping or fogging obscuring things. So it was that judicious use of compression and constant streaming of data from the game's disc led to an ever so slightly compromised version of MDK. A game that, frankly, shouldn't have been possible at all, at least to the level of this quality, on the PlayStation. All this and I've not even gone into the game itself, which is a doozy. A classic? Maybe not. But ahead of its time? Smart, funny, and great fun? Definitely. Perhaps it can be revisited with a video focusing on Shiny as a whole, eh? Indeed. My best friends at Digital Foundry went into this in significantly more techie detail than my mind could ever handle some time ago, so I'll put that link in the description. But for those of us who want less DF and more BF, I mean Bransfield, I'll continue. In short, it was absolutely ridiculous to even consider the possibility of Resident Evil 2 launching in anything approaching a good state on the N64. Sure, the console could push polygons, it could store those pre-rendered backgrounds, it could give you adequate control of Leon S. Kennedy in his exciting blue uniform. But Resi 2 was big on 3 things: its full motion video, its voice acting, and its music. This is why its original home on the PlayStation was such a perfect fit, with Sony's machine allowing Capcom's flawless sequel, yes I said it's flawless, to gobble up around 1.2 gigabytes of space for its data across 2 CDs. The N64 used cartridges. You couldn't, or wouldn't, put a game on multiple carts, and the maximum capacity of an N64 cart was 64 megabytes. That's why Resident Evil 2 coming to N64 was quite literally a laughable concept in the late 90s. How the actual crap could anything resembling the real game be brought across in anything like the way it needed to be in order for it to avoid being laughed out of the room? It's not like players would accept a cut-back reimagining of the game as they would on the handhelds of the day. This was a major home console from Nintendo, and anything that was coming to the platform direct from its fiercest competitor had to live up to lofty expectations. Well, all it took was an absolutely Herculean effort by one team of devs, who dragged in other teams of devs to help out, inventing ludicrously ahead of their time compression algorithms to absolutely cram everything into the piddly little storage space of Nintendo's chosen ass-backward storage media. Resi 2's N64 port featured every single bit of full-motion video from the CD-based original game. It was presented in lower general quality, sure, but it was all present and accounted for. Now, you might look at it today as a case of, yes, I too have made GIFs where I needed to skip frames, reduce image quality, hold on scenes with static black backgrounds, reduce resolution, and any other workarounds to make a once giant file tiny. But this was 1999, and AutoGIF-the-shit-out-of-me.net didn't exist yet. The devs had to invent this stuff from scratch. Similarly, the voiceovers were put through a digital vice the likes of which would be laughably piddling to crank into gear these days, but back then was something that needed a lot of careful, bespoke work to get the right balance between compressed enough to fit on the cartridge, but also still audible and not too tinny. It was an incredible effort, and it paid dividends. Resi 2 on N64 had all the cutscenes, all the voiceovers, every bit of those elements that made Capcom's horror classic a horror classic. On a par with the PlayStation original? Of course not. No, not at all. But they were there, and they worked, and that was impressive to the point of being ridiculous. So what about that third element, the music? Well, that's where it got more ridiculous. The N64 version, thanks to clever stuff by people, just read the Digital Foundry thing for specifics. Basically, someone pulled a rabbit out of a hat, sawed someone in half, then for their final trick re-jazzified the soundtrack to make it actually higher quality than the one on the PlayStation, including Dolby Surround and a higher sample rate to the spooky tunes. Then you had things like the option for direct control rather than your standard tank travel, additional costumes and files to read, which linked to the then not actually existing Resident Evil 0. And, well, you could make the blood blue, I guess. It certainly wasn't a half-arsed port. Another impressive aspect was while the game did use the RAM expansion pack if you had one for higher res backgrounds, I believe, it wasn't actually necessary. This whole thing worked perfectly well out of the box on a standard N64, using a cartridge that featured no additional hardware or tweaks to push things out of the realm of stock, basic-ass hardware. As I find myself repeating a lot when talking about impossible ports like these, this isn't the version of the game you'd play given the choice. For me, that'd be the Dreamcast or GameCube ports, or maybe the DualShock PlayStation re-release. But the sheer temerity on show here that a full and feature-complete version of Resident Evil 2 should launch on Nintendo's 64th console and not only not completely embarrass itself, but also improve on some elements, well, it makes this one of the absolute all-timers in the world of impossiports. The arcade original of Chase HQ is one of those games that had an impact, pun on young Bransfield. I loved it. Loved it. I played it to death on the Amiga, which saw a predictably serviceable port making its way to my home computer of choice. This was another one of those cases where nothing you had in your house back in the late 80s could actually whack out a one-to-one simulation of the coin-up version, so nobody expected anything particularly fancy from the ports. And, well, the Amstrad CPC port wasn't particularly fancy. It was clearly made for the 8-bit computer platform, it had clearly seen a huge number of things from the arcade game cut down or completely omitted, and it would never be the version of the game you'd choose to play over plenty of others, both because of the aforementioned reasons and because it was really weirdly difficult. No, I could not get off the first level while recording this. But when you look at Chase HQ in the context of the sorts of ports we were seeing on the CPC, it all comes into focus. See Outrun, another classic 80s driving game that offered a similar experience but with less car-based violence against ne'er-do-wells. Its port to the CPC? Well... And while Outrun stood out as one of the worst examples on the platform, it also wasn't that far off the general expectations set for an arcade to CPC port. Which is why Chase HQ was that much more unexpected and that much more special. It ran well enough to actually be playable. It had some digitized speech. Nancy's snide digs at your inability to smash the fenders of murderous perps were translated into a far more hurtful scrolling text form. It was the arcade game, smashed up and rebuilt to fit Amstrad's computer with more care than might have otherwise been expected. It played better than it had any right to, and it showed CPC owners the world around, all 15 of them, that they should have expected better from the arcade ports on their machines of choice. Spoiler, they didn't really get anything better as the CPC died a year after Chase HQ launched. Ah well. Alright, let's go for a triple hitter here, or triple dragon puncher maybe. The Street Fighters over the years saw some wonderful and some awful ports. The SNES was home to a lot of the best home versions of the game in the early days of the series' lifespan, but that all came to a natural end around the Super Street Fighter II era in 1994. Nintendo's console was starting to show its age, while the Street Fighter series in the arcade was happily expanding and improving into the next-gen territory of Alpha Zero prequels. It had been nice while it lasted, but from that point we were all content to see how the new generation of consoles would handle Street Fighter's journey from the arcade to our homes. The SNES would enjoy Hadouken retirement. Then, some Jobsworths at Capcom decided it'd be funny to dick about with one of the many enhancement chips available to SNES developers, and found they were able to compress assets enough to fit most of Street Fighter Alpha 2's animations, sounds and whatever else onto a SNES cartridge. Rather than stopping this larkish nonsense in its tracks, Capcom decided to let the Renegade developers keep on working at it, to the point they actually finished and released the whole game in 1996, on a console that had absolutely no right running a modern arcade game at all, never mind as well as it did. Alpha 2 already had its best contemporary home port by the time the SNES version released, with the Saturn port pipping Nintendo by about a month. So nobody who knew what was actually going on was blown away by SNES Alpha 2. But equally nobody who knew what was actually going on could be anything other than blown away about the simple fact that a really playable, solid, great-looking version of the game was available in the form of SNAlpha 2. It never really mattered that you wouldn't play this version if given the choice of any of the other ports. Its reason for being was seemingly to impress people at how ballsy its sheer existence was. I included Street Fighter Alpha 3 Upper for Game Boy Advance in a previous video about impossible GBA ports, but this one was even more surprising given it arrived on the far less grunty Game Boy Color. Street Fighter Alpha's only outing on an 8-bit platform, quite frankly, should have been an embarrassment. Instead it was pretty great? Unsurprisingly, it was also ported by Crawfish Interactive, the studio behind Alpha 3 on GBA. And just like that later release, Alpha on GBC pivoted away from being an attempt at a like-for-like conversion and instead went down the path of being built from scratch to fit the specific platform it was being aimed at. If you want to argue that this means it's not actually a port, have at it in the comments, by all means. But even though it was something very different to the original Alpha in general looks and presentation, the GBC version played fabulously well. Perfect to source? No. But it was fast and fluid, included a surprising amount of specials, combos and supers, and didn't leave you feeling stiffed on the characters available for selection. Arcade perfect? Absolutely not, don't be daft, but Street Fighter Alpha on Game Boy Color was the impossible come to life. A really bloody good Street Fighter port on a Nintendo handheld that, frankly, was massively outdated hardware by 1999. Third and finally in the Street Fighters, it's the old classic, the unattainable Dream version, the port that me and my mates would all coo over as kids, barely even able to believe it existed. Street Fighter II Champion Edition for PC Engine. I mean, for bison's sake, you could play as the bosses at home! Not like that stuffy old SNES version which only had the original 8 combatants to choose from. What boring old nonsense that was. Okay, so it was only for 1 month before Street Fighter II Turbo landed on SNES and raised the bar for home ports once again, but for a short period in 1993, the PC Engine, TurboGrafx-16 if you must, was the only home of an official Street Fighter II in which you could bumble around as Balrog, or M. Bison, given we were working with the Japanese character names here. This was big, this was special, and beyond its desirability and novelty, Champion Edition on PC Engine was just a really impressive port. The console was a mix of 8-bit and 16-bit architecture, with the graphics processing home to that higher spec. This helped explain why the PC Engine was capable of running a game that looked as good as SF2CE despite its central processor being pretty much a NES on steroids. I'm oversimplifying and I don't care. The fact is, this was one of the best ports of Street Fighter II early on in the game's lifetime. It had the market on playing as bosses all to itself for a brief period, and believe me, we cared about that a lot in 1993. And even after all the other better versions did make their way out in the years that followed, the PC Engine was always able to hold its head high in the knowledge it was home to one of the most surprising, impressive, and seemingly impossible ports of the Champion Edition. You had a fair few FPSs on PS1 that worked fine, were made for the system, and showed it was possible to get the popular run-and-gunning genre up and running, and gunning on Sony's console. So really anyone bringing a PC heavy hitter to PlayStation had no excuses for doing a crappy job. I mean, except for the PS1's piddling specs compared to the PCs of the day, its lack of online multiplayer functionality, and a default controller that wasn't best suited to the FPS genre, and a then new analog controller that devs hadn't quite figured out how to fit properly with the control scheme we all know and tolerate today. Quake 2 didn't fix that last one, by the way. It had a twin stick setup if using an analog pad, but it was a bit off in its implementation. Naturally, you see me here playing a hacked version of the game that has proper modern FPS controls jammed into it so I can actually play it properly with my brain of today instead of the barely developed brain of 1999 I originally played this game with. But I digress. What Quake 2 on PS1 did do was upend all expectations of what could be squeezed out of a console with practically nothing going for it compared to the ultra-spec PCs you'd seen running id Shooter. You looked at the PC version, you compared it directly to what came to PS1, and yeah, the port had nothing on the original. But away from those direct comparisons, what you had was a fully featured translation of an incredible PC game, squeezed, crammed and compressed as much as possible to fit neatly on one blackback CD, and optimised with a tremendous amount of skill and care to somehow make it run really bloody well on a then 4-year-old console that had absolutely no business running a game like Quake 2. Never mind running it well. Again, going deep into the techie stuff isn't in my wheelhouse particularly. Check out the Modern Vintage Gamer video link below for that sort of thing. Also, while we didn't get a rogue modem peripheral built to augment Quake 2 on PS1, we did get an absolutely fabulous 4-player multiplayer mode. 1 PlayStation, 1 TV, 1 multi-tap, 4 controllers, 1 mad dash to get the railgun. I don't have any quality footage of 4-player as there doesn't seem to be any on YouTube for me to borrow, and I don't have friends these days to play and record with, but you get the gist from this grainy nonsense. Safe to say, back at the turn of the millennium, Quake 2 was on heavy rotation in the houses of me and my friends. Though, mainly my friends as my dad didn't let us play games on the big telly downstairs. Quake 2's PlayStation version was better than we could have reasonably expected. It skillfully captured the essence of what made the PC original such a great balls-out sci-fi blaster, and it did it all while pushing the console to its limit and, simultaneously, being very careful in how it went about doing so. Never really going too far or asking too much of the hardware. I'm a really big fan of Quake 2 on PS1 in case it's not obvious. Thanks for watching. Thanks for waiting, good crikey, 4 actual years for the second part of these lists, and special thanks to my patrons on Patreon, who you can join at the link below for early access to videos, high quality video downloads, and random musings direct from my brain. Oh, or YouTube memberships too, I turned those on. Anyway, patrons! I'm off to see how many of the games I'm still wanting to talk about for future entries to this series of videos have already been covered in much more detail by Chiropolis Digital Foundry and Modern Vintage Gamer. Bye!